All right, another sleepless night for Ukrainians. The country's leader says that Russia launched 400 drones and a missile in overnight attacks on 4 different regions, killing at least 3 people. President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih in central Ukraine was one place that came under bombardment. An official says the attack started several fires and left parts of the city without power and water. Meantime, U.S. President Donald Trump says that new Patriot defensive missiles are on their way to Ukraine. He said the U.S. is not sending longer-range missiles. Will not be sent there, and added that Ukraine should not target Moscow.
Now, the president is defending his decision to give Russia 50 days to make peace or face tariffs and secondary sanctions. Russian officials say they aren't worried about that threat, though.
50 days? It used to be 24 hours. It used to be 100 days. We've been through all of this.
CNN's Nick Paton-Walsh joins us live now from London. So, Nick, you know, obviously Russia, to nobody's surprise, has stepped up its attacks on Ukraine, even after President Donald Trump has made some economic threats. When you think about that 50-day window, I mean, what are we expecting? What can Russia actually accomplish in terms of attacking Ukraine in that 50-day window?
I mean, that is less of a knowable thing, frankly, given that they appear to have been putting as much pressure as they can on certain parts of the front line over recent months. The Ukrainians suggested for some time that there's 160,000 Russian troops potentially amassing. So there may be a moment where they choose to apply greater pressure to one specific area. But the 50 days has a different real impact in that it, as you heard there from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, just adds to a series of deadlines that we've heard the Trump administration set mostly towards Russia to achieve a kind of peace. And so I think for China and India, who are predominantly who those secondary sanctions would impact, if indeed they were implemented, I think you're more likely in Beijing or New Delhi to calculate that Trump will change his mind on the deadline or not even honor it than you are to entirely recalibrate your energy market and stop buying the Russian oil and gas that they're both so desperately dependent upon. But it has, as you say, suggested that there is a window of the summer for Russia to move ahead in, and maybe what we've seen in the aerial assaults here, some analysts suggest might be a prelude to that, or a bid for Russia, who's not seeing success yet on the front lines, to exact some kind of cost against Ukraine's population. It was Kharkiv hit quite hard today, 2 dead in the areas around that, 16 drones landing in 14 minutes, said a local official there, and President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih indeed hit by what one local leader there called it the largest attack since the start of the war. Volodymyr Zelensky, who's been host to Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, over the past days, in fact suggested in an interview that the capital Kiev hadn't been hit over past days with a substantial attack because Kellogg had indeed been there. He joked that perhaps they should give Kellogg a Ukrainian passport, get him to move there, but suggested the lack of attack perhaps suggested that Moscow was afraid of the United States and didn't want to see hit their envoy in a substantial wave of drone attacks. Look, it's hard really to assess quite what Moscow's immediate goals are. They clearly use these aerial attacks to terrify large amounts of Ukraine and hit its key infrastructure, but it's another sign of how urgently Ukraine needs air defences. Trump has suggested that Patriot missiles may be there within days or on their way. Germany suggested it may take months potentially for new batteries to arrive, but that at least military gesture is one of the smallest things Trump could have done, and Ukraine urgently in need of more.
All right, Nick Paton-Walsh, live for us in London. Thank you.
A major attack in Ukraine while the U.S. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg is still in the country. President Zelensky's hometown was among the cities hit by hundreds of Russian drones targeting energy infrastructure, the barrage leaving behind massive fires. This new attack comes as Ukraine's president is also now speaking out in a new interview, saying that sanctions and offensive weapons, both are needed to get Russia to the negotiating table, suggesting anything short of that won't work. Zelensky telling Newsmax this: the Russians understand only force, so only strong sanctions and only strong sanctions and only strong weapons. Yesterday, President Trump declared publicly that he is not sending long-range missiles and does not want Ukraine to target Moscow.
Should Zelensky target Moscow or deeper into Russia?
No, he shouldn't target Moscow.
Are you looking to give long-range missiles to Ukraine as well? And that you have about 50 days.
No, we're not looking to do that. I'm on nobody's side. I want to, you know the side I'm on? Humanity's side.
Joining us right now, CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Thanks both for being here. Let's start, Colonel, with what we've learned from President Trump. Trump saying no to long-range missiles, saying publicly he does not want Ukraine to target, to hit Moscow. How much does that blunt the good news, if it does, that Ukraine got from the president with the announcement on Monday?
Well, good morning, Kate. Yeah, it does blunt it somewhat because the initial reports about the aid that the U.S. would funnel through NATO included the possibility of long-range weapons that would go to the Ukrainians. Now, the other side of this is that the Ukrainians do have some capabilities that they've built indigenously that can actually hit Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the Ukrainians are not completely incapable of doing those things and of basically holding those two cities at risk. So it's a mixed message, but it does blunt it somewhat, absolutely.
And Kim, hearing that from President Trump, and also when he says that, he said it previously, but in the context of this week and the tonal shift we'd heard from President Trump, it seems newly significant when he says, I'm not taking anybody's side. What message does that send to Vladimir Putin right now, do you think?
Well, he's saying he's not taking anyone's side, but once again, he's extended a deadline for Vladimir Putin, giving Putin's forces more chances to take more territory on the ground in Ukraine, and also to increase terrorizing the country. You know, in the first year of the war, 2022 to 2023, they used about 2,000 Shahed drones across the country against the Ukrainians. This year, it's up to more than 5,000 drones, plus ballistic missiles, etc. And not just hitting military areas, but it looks like the Russians have chosen to start hitting civilian areas across the country in this most recent round to terrorize the people, break the will, perhaps, of the troops, and as Putin reportedly told Trump, use the next 50 days to take as much territory as he can.
And Colonel, then hearing what Zelensky is now spelling out in this new interview, and I'll read the quote according to Newsmax of what he said, which is, President Trump and all of America and Europe know that we want peace and an end to the war, but the Russians understand only force. So only strong sanctions and only strong weapons. We are ready for action for a demonstration of force. He may be careful here in his wording, but do you hear him laying out that what is being offered, what has been announced by the White House, is not enough?
Yeah, in part, I think Zelensky is saying that, Kate, but of course, he has to walk a very fine line. He's grateful for the weapons that are potentially being delivered to Ukraine, such as the Patriots and some of the other munitions that are part of these packages that are supposed to get there. But the problem is this: none of this is going to change anything that is on the ground. And if you don't change the conditions on the ground, you're not going to give Putin the incentive that he needs in order to actually go to the negotiating table and go there seriously. So, as Kim was laying out perfectly, these are the kinds of things that are basically going on right now. And when it comes to the areas on the ground, such as the area around Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine, those areas are contested. There are huge Russian troop concentrations there, and those are the kinds of targets that the Ukrainians absolutely need to get at. But they also need to get at the areas where those troops are being supplied from, where those troops are being commanded from. And that's what the Ukrainians not only want to do, but they need to do from a military standpoint.
And Kim, it's going to be a big question of how the White House, how the president interprets what we hear from President Zelensky now. But you're deeply sourced throughout Europe. What are you hearing from your sources about how they read all of this?
On the one hand, they are thrilled that the U.S. has given them permission to buy these weapon systems and give them to Ukraine. They don't know, however, how many weapon systems and how soon they'll be allowed to do this. Ukraine does urgently need those Patriot defensive systems because Ukraine's right now having to make choices. Do you protect the civilian areas or do you protect military bases? They don't have enough air defense systems to do both. But in the long term, what the U.S. has just done is taking itself out of the funding picture. So far, the U.S. has given about $77 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and Europe has given $82 billion in aid. Europe is now going to have to shoulder that alone at a time of tight defense budgets when they're all supposed to be raising their own defense spending. So that is a tough equation.